It'll be in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. Also, you can use that chat pod if you have any questions. I know Sarah's going to be asking for a little interaction today, so keep that chat pod handy so you can speak with her today and interact with her. You can see that a full-size PDF version of the slides is available in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen right now. It says Oral History PDF. You can also get that at the end of today's presentation as well. And this webinar is being recorded, and it'll be posted on our archived webinars page under the local history section within a week's time of today's webinar. I think that's all of the housekeeping. And it looks like the first three answers are pretty similar, but interview process and equipment maybe. So, and everybody's just afraid of building a team. We don't want to know about that now.
They already have excellent teams. That's what it is.
They
don't need to know how to do that. They know who they want to work with.
That's right. And this webinar is scheduled to be captioned. A captioner will be running a little late today, so that will be happening here shortly. So let's go ahead and change over into our presentation. And I will introduce our speaker for today. She's Sarah Schmitt from the Kentucky Oral History Commission. And I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Sarah.
Okay. The Kentucky Oral History Commission is a part of the Kentucky Historical Society. It is its own entity within the Historical Society, and it was established in 1976, and you can kind of guess by the year why and how it was established. It was the bicentennial fervor that was going on in the nation, but also in the state, and it was sort of the brainchild of a journalist, Al Smith, two journalists actually, and John Ed Pierce. It is gubernatorially appointed. We have 12 members on that commission, and one of them is Terry Manuel, who is the director of KDLA, and one of them is the director of the Kentucky Historical Society. So really both state government agencies have an interest in making sure that this commission thrives and that we're doing good work. And that work would be essentially fostering documentation of Kentucky's unique history from a perspective outside of regular documentary means. So just to put it really kind of frankly, we interview underdocumented people, those who aren't usually represented in archival material, folks that don't have a lot of material culture to donate to a museum, and those that don't leave a lot of paper behind. And that could be anything from folks that are geographically isolated, ethnic and racial groups that have been historically discriminated against, people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, because the reality is that the Historical Society, a lot of what we have and a lot of what is donated to us comes from, upper class, wealthy, not really people that get their hands dirty kind of, and that's great. How we are so grateful for that, but we want to make sure that that historical record is really representing all kind of lived experiences in Kentucky. So in the earliest project of the Kentucky Oral History Commission was to, when we were still actually housed in the Department of Library and Archives, was to send recorders and tapes to every Kentucky library in the state and to request that they do interviews and return them to us in Frankfort, and then we would make copies of those and send those out to the libraries. And you all may have some of those early recordings within your own library collections. So we share those records in common. So in the spirit of kind of continuing that work and recognizing that local libraries are some of the greatest sources of training, of learning about your area and local history. Um, I look to public libraries all the time to be partners in collecting stories about the places in which they live. So without further ado, let's talk about how to do that. So I get this a lot. I'm not an oral historian. Can you come interview all of these people for me? Well, I have 120 counties to do that in, and um, quite a few Kentuckians that really have great stories that need to be recorded. So, and really, these projects are best done on a local level. The good news is this is my grandmother's cookbook you're looking at. As you can see, she was not a great cook. And she tried to cook the book itself. I'm sure that was by accident. But I say this to say to you that you can't see me right now, but none of my family went hungry. You can tell that by looking at me. So she just got better through practice. And truly, truly, don't tell anybody. But this is something that can be learned by anyone. It is a practice. When I say it's a practice, it truly is something that you have to practice. Your first interview, unless you're just a dynamo, is going to be rough. It's not going to be perfect, but it is something that the more you do it, the better you get. And the keys to the process are to be familiar with your equipment. You will find yourself in your kitchen doing vocal exercises in your equipment just to test it and try it and get to learn it more. So knowing that, preparing vigorously, so making sure that you've researched the topic you're going to be asking this person about, and making sure you know a lot about them, especially if it's what we call an elite interview, someone with a career that you could learn more about simply by looking at newspaper articles and things like that. Listening intently. So making sure that when you're sitting down in an interview, that you're really focusing on that person and what they're saying, and you're not waiting for your next turn to talk. I'm sure everybody's been in a conversation with somebody where it was clear that they were sort of half listening but mostly waiting for their turn to say something. That's not what this is. It's not a conversation. And then the last but not least at all, it's actually one of the most important things, is to care painstakingly for the files that you create. So we're in the digital age. I started doing oral histories on cassette tapes. Obviously, they had their need for care in an archive, and in a digital world, we're now creating digital files. Recording audio these days is very similar to taking a picture digitally. You create just like you would create a JPEG file when you create a picture with your cell phone. You're creating a MP3, or I'll tell you about the preferred file type, and they have to be cared for in a very specific way that's a lot different from how you care for a cassette tape. And you never want to embark on an oral history project unless you're absolutely sure that this hours and hours and hours of work and these very important stories that people were kind enough and open enough to share with you are going to be cared for. You don't want them to be lost. So if you're here, I'm assuming that you think you know what an oral history is, but it is a very specific discipline. There's no oral history program within Kentucky. In other words, there's no school that you can go to get a degree in oral history. But there are a lot of folklorists who are trained in the state who do know how to do oral histories. There are quite a few public historians. There are journalists that do it. But it is its own discipline, and Columbia University is probably the considered one of the top tier. Baylor is also has a great program. That's just to name a few. But they do have a very specific definition of what it is that oral history is comprised of. So it's a recorded dialogue between two people that captures personal memories of historic significance. This is my definition, and it's culled from a lot of different sources. I kind of took the key points of a lot of different oral historians' treatise on the topic and combined it into my own. And I've highlighted a few words, and there's good reason for that. So I'm going to go over those specifically. It is recorded. So, and when I say recorded, necessarily with technology. This is a technology-dependent discipline. in the same way that photography is now a technology dependent discipline. In the same way that drawing someone's portrait is different than shooting a photo of somebody, writing down someone's history is very different than doing an oral history. So it's not things that are written down, it is recorded. Um, it is a dialogue. So it's not, like I said before, it's not a conversation, and it's also not an inquisition. So even though you're going to hear less of the interviewer than the interviewee, you're not doing just the facts, ma'am, and grilling them for information. So you have to walk a very fine line. You should hear far more of the subject's voice than the interviewer's. It's not storytelling. Although recorded oral tradition is a really similar discipline, it is not that. Rapport and trust matter, um, because your questions are going to be phrased in such a way to elicit a profound response. Discussing memories, both good and bad, and sometimes neutral, can be very emotional. And so you handle your interview with kid gloves, and obviously, you're not going to, you're not on television, and you're not trying to get an athlete to cry. It's not that type of thing, but it does happen. It is two people. I feel very strongly about this. I think that there's often let's get several people together and interview them, and that way they can play off of each other. The problem with that is when you're already bringing a recorder into the equation, which can change the way that people answer questions. When you bring other people in, they have what's called social desirability. So they may not want to answer the question the way they would otherwise, because even if it's just, kind of unconscious or subconscious, they care about what other people say about especially if it's folks that they know. So I really think one-on-one is important. There are some exceptions, of course. Sometimes it's good to interview like a husband and a wife together, because they almost share one memory, right? Sometimes it's the worst idea in the world to interview a husband and a wife together, because one will feel like they must answer for the other. So, getting to know your interviewees beforehand is important, because then you will know, I absolutely have to separate these two people, because they may be of one mind, or they may just be of one mouth. So, the other thing is, when you're listening to recordings later, as a researcher, it's very difficult to determine one person's voice from another, especially if they're all the same gender, in a room full of people. And so you're not able to attribute thoughts to the correct people. So, it's simpler if it's one-on-one. If you do have a group of people to interview, just maybe get them together as a group beforehand, and then interview them separately later. And that way you can write down some of those dynamic thoughts that come up in a group setting and ask questions about it later. But there's no longer that, that elephant in the room of having to worry about what other people think. It is personal memory. I do get a lot of people who tell, oh, well, you record the truth about what really happened. No, I record memories. These are not considered facts. As a matter of fact, if you're using oral histories as a researcher, you would never use those exclusive to other records. This is someone's lived experience. And as we all know, memory is just a liar. It's a lying liar. And psychologically, every time you recall a memory, you actually change it. Your memories are formed each time reformed each time you recall them. So these are just personal memories. We're not going to call them the truth. They're kind of someone's own truth, or maybe a certain group of people's truth about an incident, but it's not like the big truth with a capital T. And they are of historic significance. So what that means is, we're not journalists, obviously. We're not recording in the moment the way that they do, and in the way that they do. But we are recording things that don't have to necessarily be within the distant past. We sort of know in a 24-hour news cycle now things that are going to be significant And we don't have to wait necessarily until someone is 40 or 50 years after the incident before we begin recording people's lived experiences. Obviously, there are delicate things that do require time. We don't want to be going out and interviewing incidents with associated trauma right away. That's just sort of irresponsible. However, if something has happened and it happens to someone that's 20 years old, don't wait until they're 70 before you begin thinking of interviewing. It's really important to interview people of all ages at different stages of life. And we should really be interviewing people today about recent events and not sort of waiting. We don't have to anymore. The technology is right at our hand. The only thing we have to develop are the listening skills, which are sometimes not quite at hand. So this is a little bit cheeky, but it helps me. It's a good reminder. It's a good kind of humorous reminder of all the things, all of those aspects of an oral history. So remember that all oral histories are recorded interviews, but not all recorded interviews are oral histories necessarily. Particularly, journalists will record their interviews. They may or may not fall into that category. There's a fine line. Oral histories might be conducted with tradition bearers, but not all recordings of tradition bearers are oral histories. So people that are doing storytelling or playing a musical instrument, obviously you can do an oral history interview with them, but that a recording in itself doesn't mean that that's necessarily what it is. And all are important. They just have their unique place in their own methodology. And so the top left is what they call unpopular opinion puffin, I think. And he says some kind of like awful unpopular opinion when he stomps around, I guess. And it says only older people should be narrators of oral histories. Younger people have not experienced enough to be interviewed. Absolutely not. As long as somebody is 18 years old and willing to share their stories, you can record what's going on in their lives. And young people are experiencing lots of really historically important things all of the time. Always have been, truly, throughout history. And you can interview minors as well. Obviously, it's just like anything else. You have to get their parents' permission, and it does require some extra paperwork, but it can be done. Um, and like I said, you don't want to wait until somebody's memories have been changed and changed and changed through recollection before you document their experience. The the second one, going to the middle and the top, is Fight Me Girl. And I will often have somebody come to me. I'll introduce myself as an oral historian. They'll go, "Oh, I wrote down my family's oral history." And in my head, this is what I'm thinking. Because, like I said, it's not a written process. It is not necessarily a recorded process. Bottom left, this is the eye-rolling Tony Stark. Should be Tony Snark. And this is how complicated it is. Really awful to listen to an oral history with four narrators being interviewed because it is so hard to tell their voices apart. And obviously, people start talking all over the top of each other. It's like going into a bar every time you have to do one of these. And then this has changed my mind guy. He has a firmly held belief and then invites you to change his mind. Oral histories are not a conversation. They are not a conversation. They are a dialogue, and they're also not an interrogation. Last but not least, this is Batman slapping Robin. Robin says something stupid, and then Batman slaps it out of him, essentially. And Robin says, "Oral histories are the truth about what really," and then Batman says, "Slap their personal memories." So anyway, these are just humorous things to remind you of all of those aspects I just discussed. And now we'll get into the meat part of it. Oops. Oh, well, it did work. So because this was sort of the least popular part of the discussion in terms of what we told you about earlier, we are going to go over it, but I will spend more time on those things which you were most interested. So we'll sort of we'll take this at a good pace. So community I think oral history projects are best done as a team. I obviously, an individual can go out and do interviews on their own just fine, but there are assets to putting a team together. Um, so, after you've determined a topic and scope, what you want to do interviews about, um, I think the next step is to get kind of a focus group together or a meeting of representatives of those groups that might be either interested in the topic you're going to be exploring or who might be affected by your topic. So I'm just going to use World War II veterans as an example because that's frankly a lot of the oral history projects that uh, have been done, are being done in public library settings, and it's there's a lot of interest in it in the interviews that we have in our repository. So, if you were going to be interviewing World War II veterans, who do you think, and you can use your chat box, who do you think might be good representatives to get together? And these would be people who would be interested in the topic or affected by your project. They don't have to be people that would be doing interviews necessarily, but people that could help you find interviewees, help you come up with good questions, talk about maybe some of the issues that you would face when talking to narrators. What might be some barriers? And I see that you all are typing, and I'll wait for your responses and then we'll talk about it. Okay, Leanne Paxton said veterans program administrators. Yeah, I think that's they're going to be able to get you in touch with people. They can talk about some of the thing. Another important thing that you're going to want to know is what kind of research has already been done. Like if a lot of these projects have already been done, you want to make sure you're not asking the same people over and over again in your area to share their story, and frankly, who hasn't been interviewed and for what reasons. Um, the head of your local VFW, obviously, they're going to help you find interviewees. There's also a little bit of a, I don't want to say selfish, but maybe self serving reason to get these people together. They might have some money, a little something, something. They might be willing to help you buy equipment or rent equipment. So that's not a bad idea. Obviously, you don't want to make that ask outright. Local church groups are a great resources. If nothing else, they may be able to offer you space. Senior centers are fantastic. When you're talking about an issue of memory, if we all live long enough, God willing, we're going to have issues with our memory. So senior centers and the staff there are going to be able to help you be sensitive to and maybe overcome some of those barriers to that, whether it's day programs or folks living in a center, either way. I think I see one more coming in and then we'll move on. Nursing homes, absolutely. Yeah, I kind of put that in the same category as senior centers, but it's really not. A live-in facility is going to be different than like an adult senior centers program. And someone said students. Absolutely. So thank you very much. The researchers that are going to be using this absolutely should be involved. Another thing is students are going to be a great asset. Depending on a high school student is going to be comfortable with the technology probably. They're going to benefit from it academically to be involved. And then, of course, they're the generation that's going to be using this stuff as researchers. So being involved in a project like this and giving their input would be a great idea. So you can continue to chat, and I'll take a look at that every once in a while. And the next thing that you're going to do, so after you've kind of gotten this focus group together and asked them about potential questions and possible interviewees, and maybe quietly ask them for some money or help with equipment, or can we use your space or something like that. Can you help me work with the families? Then you're going to build a team. So maybe you're the primary interview. Maybe you're the only one that's interested in interviewing. But there are lots of different roles that folks can play. So you need a project manager. There's someone that keeps all the working parts going. And by working parts, if you do have multiple interviewers, you're going to have somebody that's checking on the equipment, like a equipment manager, testing it when it comes back in. Things do break, things need to be cleaned. And then you're going to need to have somebody who um, it's kind of a pre-archivist position. So it's not the person that actually takes it and cares for it for time immemorial, but it's an archivist who is going to name all the files in a consistent way and make sure that they're backed up, that they're all easily accessible, but also safe and secure. So someone just to kind of organize those things before they go to the repository, to keep up with the paperwork. Always have to have somebody to keep up with the paperwork, and I'll explain later, but there's legal ramifications for all of this, and it's important to keep that in check. So even if someone maybe does not feel comfortable interviewing, is not comfortable with the equipment, and no matter how much training you do is never going to, there's still a role for them. It's nice to just have someone that's a liaison. If you're doing a veterans project, it doesn't hurt to have, if you're not a veteran yourself, someone who's been in uniform to go to the interviews with you, or at least meet with that person the first time and establish that rapport and trust. So that doesn't mean that they are interviewing necessarily, but they serve a role within your project. You're going to want to look at the diversity on your team, because the reality is not everybody experiences history or events in history the same way, and not everybody experiences place the same way. And so, if you look at your team and everybody has the same skin tone, they're all the same gender, they are all the same age group, that's going to be a problem. And even when I'm interviewing alone, I accept the reality that sometimes I'm not going to get an interview due to bias. That it would be better, just because of talking to this person or knowing this person or knowing the tradition that they represent or the story they're going to possibly tell me, that it would be better if a man went to the interview. I can't change that person. It's not my job to change that person. It's my job to get the interview and to make them feel comfortable. And so I have a friend I can call across town at the Kentucky Arts Council to do this for me, who just happens to be a man. Same thing. I recognize that if I'm talking to someone of a different race or ethnicity, particularly if they speak a language, maybe they speak English, but they prefer to do the interview in their native language because it's what they're more comfortable with. I'm not going to get that interview. I need to find somebody that can do that with them in a way that makes sense. If I'm speaking to somebody who we're talking about issues of discrimination, and I am white essentially, and they're not comfortable speaking with the dominant group that oppressed them, then I'm not going to get that interview, and that's okay. I need to find somebody else that they're comfortable with to do that. And so having a diverse team can help overcome some of those barriers. Like I said, we're not gonna change hearts and minds overnight, but we can be sensitive to what is going to get the best interview and make those folks the most comfortable they can be in the interview process. So divide up the tasks. Like I said, there's more roles than just that of an interview. And then make sure that folks are trained. Obviously, this is going to be archived. And what I have a picture up here is a program through the Kentucky Arts Council called Community Scholars. This is a 6-class program that goes more in depth into all of this. And you get a chance to practice. So if you're interested in starting a community oral history project in your area, at your library, or even in your own life, having them come and do this training for your project team is helpful. I can take this show on the road, and I can also tailor it so that it's specific to the type of project that you're going to be doing. So thinking about their training is important, and be honest with your team about the time commitment too. So it can be time consuming. The interview process, most interviews run between 45 and 120 minutes. And this is a little quiz for you. I want to see who the analog and the digital folks are in the room.
Mhm.
Why do you think typical interviews, at least historically, have run between 45 and 120 minutes? Christy Terry knows.
There you go.
That's right. It's the old cassette length. So it was either one side of a 90-minute tape or both sides of a 60 or 120-minute tape that had 60 on each side. So, yeah, we find that they run between, and even in the digital age, we've found that that's as much as you can sustain. This can be an exhausting process. Man, if I go longer than an hour, I ate my Wheaties that morning because it really is hard to do everything all at once and really listen intently. So you have to be honest about how long that's going to take just to do the interview. That doesn't include all of the research you have to do in advance and all of that relationship building. And then there's some, we'll get into this more in depth, but there's stuff you have to do on the back end too. So um, I'm going to ask too if anybody has any questions about building teams or community oral history projects. Quick questions. If you have longer ones, I'm going to give you my contact information and you can give me the whole 5-paragraph version if you have a longer one. All right, I don't see anybody typing, so I'm going to move.
One about the next community scholars class.
Oh, the next community scholars class. I see that now. I'm not sure if you contact Mark Brown. He is pictured. He's the very tall gentleman on the right side of that photograph. He is the one that does the training for the Kentucky Arts Council. He is a folklorist. He's trained. We went to the same alma mater. We worked together for years, shared an office for a long time. I think he's really glad he doesn't have to do that with me anymore because I'm very chatty and he's very quiet. He's a nice guy. They do that on a sort of demand basis. So if you have a group already together, that would be the first step. Call them and they will come to you. But in terms of what's already scheduled that you might be able to get in and on as an individual, I'm not really sure. I haven't seen a press release or anything about it, but he would be able to tell you. Tell him I sent you. There you go. That's him. Mark Brown. So, the questions that are up on the screen right now are essentially going to be your project plan. This is something that you're going to want to have all answered and in writing before you even start. And this doesn't matter, even if you're doing stuff as an individual, you really want to have these questions completely answered before you beginning. The nice thing is if you're writing for grant funding or some other type of community foundation, you're going to have answers to these questions anyway. So it also makes a nice one-page document for any potential project volunteers or staff, or even some of your interviewees, because you know sometimes you'll get some suspicion. Why are you even doing this? And so being able to lay all of this out is really helpful. Other considerations you might want to add to this list of questions include, of course, a why statement. Why are we even doing this at all? Who is it important to? And how does this add to the historical research? Are researchers clamoring for this? Will they be in the future? So answering why you're even doing this. I will tell you in the 21st century, just saying that we're recording memories so that they don't get lost is not good enough because it's not a, I'm not saying it's not a valid argument, it's just not one that funders are responding to as much anymore because we live in a society where we document everything. So how is this contributing to all of the information we just from tweets and Facebook and tons and millions of digital photos people are taking and video? How does this rise above that and become more than noise? You're gonna have to make a better argument than that. And frankly, because people are aging and we might not collect them otherwise, is not that great an interview anyway. I have 10,000 interviews in my repository, all of people telling very, very similar stories that are being interviewed because they're aging. And so as much as I believe everybody has a unique story, it's hard to make that argument to someone that wants to pay you to do it. Let's put it that way. Another thing is this going to be sponsored? Are your team members going to be paid? And are you going to be logging volunteer hours? So obviously, this is something if you have to have an in-kind match for like a grant, then you're going to want to know in advance before people get started that we got to log volunteer hours and how we're going to do it. That's not something you want to remember halfway through the project. And then an anticipated number of interviews and a time frame. So is this going to be an ongoing project? You know, we're going to collect and collect, and we're going to grow this collection until, you know, people lose interest? Or are we going to do this for a season? You know, we're commemorating our anniversary, you know, our 40-year anniversary, and we're going to do it this year, and then maybe we'll pick it up again in 10 years. Or no, this is a closed collection. We're doing 30 interviews, the end. But knowing that type of scope is important because it can get unfundable, hard to care for, and all of those awful things. So, oh, and I should mention, we're going over each of these questions in depth, and how to answer them and how to go about finding resources. So, where will your interviews live? So it's kind of counterintuitive, but the last thing that happens to your interview, which is going somewhere for safe storage, is the first thing that you need to know, because a lot of your other decisions are going to be sort of contingent upon that. I feel strongly that oral history interviews should go to a public repository. And obviously, well, there are university programs. There are some museums in the state that will take them. Obviously, we take oral history interviews, but there's the Nunn Center at UK. But a lot of times you have to contact them in advance and say, this is my topic. Are you interested in these? Once you've already done the interviews and they say, no, it doesn't really fit our scope, well, then it's, you know, then you have to hunt around for a home. And then local public libraries obviously meet all of these aspects of a good repository on the right, which is they accept archival material. Some of them do. It's climate controlled. All of them are. They employ trained personnel. Absolutely. You all are trained personnel. It's open to the public. Somehow, you all are very much open to the public. Provide some kind of searchable index or database. Boom. Makes sense with the project topic. If there is a project that is happening locally, it should stay locally. It shouldn't be shipped off somewhere else. It should be within the community that is invested in it. So you all are the best possible place. The only sticky wicket, and you could tell I skipped over this one, was they accept and care for born digital files. It's not to say that public libraries necessarily don't. I'm just telling you some of the reasons why they may be hard to care for versus some of your other media. They can be large. These files are uncompressed. They're big, take up a lot of space. Not physical space, obviously, but they're going to have to be stored redundantly on different types of storage media. You have to do some kind of combination of a deep cloud, or a backed up and maintained server or hard drive. And so not only do they take up storage space, they take up multiple storage spaces per interview. They have to be checked for fixity on a regular basis. In other words, digital data can rot, which was news to me. And the file should be checked for discrepancies and errors on a regular basis. You have to have somebody to do that. It can be, it's basically a process where you hit enter, but you have to have the appropriate software to do it, and you have to have somebody that's looking at that calendar and doing it regularly. And then if you find discrepancy and errors with the files, you're going to have to replace them with sound files from another stored set. So you can imagine if you've got 20 of them, not such a big deal. If you've got 10,000, it's a huge deal. And then you also have to store any kind of signed documents and other accompanying paperwork. Sometimes people give you photos. Sometimes people will share like memorabilia and ephemera with you. And then, of course, you're always going to have your metadata, paper metadata, like background sheets and the signed release forms that are going to have to be stored in an archival manner. So that means acid-free boxes, all of those types of things. So um, if you're not already accepting and caring for born digital files, these are the considerations that your institution is going to have to look at to decide if you want to do it. You can always partner or figure something out between you and the local historical society. And there's another option. So if you don't think that your institution is ready for this, you can always go into a secondary repository agreement. So you can donate them to a bigger repository like us or one of the university programs, and then you sign a secondary repository agreement for that collection, which gives you all or some of the rights for access. KHS's agreement, for example, gives you all the same rights that we would have to housing that collection, as long as you provide an acknowledgement that we store them. All we want to do, all we want is to be recognized, for our sacrifice. So and people ask me, well, if I want to just do interviews with my family members and store them at home, well, yes, you can, but the same things still apply. Obviously, controlled climate. Don't put them in your basement or attic. I don't want any more moldy tapes or moldy paper. You have to plan for media obsolescence. So that's one thing that a repository will do for you that is hard to do for yourself. If, right now we record things on digital files. I'm sure when reel-to-reel tapes came out, everybody thought, well, this is it. This is like the best it could possibly be. There's nothing else beyond that. I have no idea how we're going to be recording interviews in the future, chips in our brain, whatever the case may be. But institutions who accept things like that are responsible for migrating them to the new media to make sure that they can still be played on something. We have reel-to-reel, we have open reel tape. Luckily, everything in our repository has all been digitized because I have 3 reel-to-reel players, none of which work at any given time. Like I might have one that can do this and one that can do that, and then a third one that's basically a doorstop. It's really hard to maintain obsolete equipment, but that's what we do. So, and unless you're really committed to keeping a reel-to-reel player forever, well, or maybe the future's version of that, I guess, donating them to a repository makes sense. And then, of course, you still have to practice redundancy. So you need to invest in some kind of like Amazon Glacier service or some type of secure cloud storage. Keep them on some type of hard drive, and then check those on a regular basis. So even if you have a home repository, the same things still apply. If you've ever had a computer hard drive failure and you know how heartbreaking that could be, imagine if it was your grandma's interview and then your heart breaks 5 more times. And then also, just like in a public repository, you have to take all those signed documents and you have to store them archivally, which means you're investing in your own archival acid-free paper in boxes and folders and such. Does anybody have any questions about taking care of interviews? I don't see any chatting, but in some ways, libraries are better equipped than us. You all have a lot of great resources in terms of particularly making things accessible. That's where you all shine, is making sure that people have access to the interviews. If you've ever tried to get something from a university archive, it's not, some are better than others, but it's not great. So what type of paperwork is required? At the very least, every single interview should be accompanied by a legal release agreement. You might see this called a couple of different things. It's called a release form. It's called a deed of gift. It's called an informed consent form, but at the root, they're all fall under a legal release agreement. And this is going to be a document that essentially says that I, the interviewee, give the repository the interview. And you can add more details. You can say for this particular project to be used in this way, but those are the two main things: stating the name and talking about who gets to care for it and essentially do rights and reproductions requests for it. Um, I will say that I always leave an area for restrictions on these. Archives hate restrictions, but I am very clear about what I mean. So, for example, I don't let anybody say that you can't use this interview while I'm still alive, because that means the poor archivist has to check the obituaries every day to see if they can make this interview available. I usually do a time based. So, if the person's 97 years old, a 25-year restriction is reasonable. 50 if they're looking spry. Um, so that it's understood that at this date it's going to be available. Um, I also want to be clear that just because they give it to a repository, that it also, they don't lose their ownership of it. And you don't lose your ownership of it as an interviewee. So, for example, just because I am giving my interview to the Kentucky Historical Society doesn't mean that I can't write a play or other derivative work based on what we discussed as both the interviewer or the interviewee. And I am very conservative about legal release agreements. Ours is very short because we have so many different projects. You might want to make yours more specific and talk about how it will be used. The only problem with that is if you decide later when a new media comes around that say you were just going to store them in your archive, but now it seems like a cool idea to do a podcast. If you've kind of put bookends around that release, you then have to go back to that person or his or her family and ask for additional rights ethically. I don't know about legally. I'm not a lawyer. I don't even play one on TV. But ethically, you should always ask. Like I said, I'm very conservative. I will not accept interviews that do not have legal release agreements. We do have them in our archive from the early days. And when people ask to use them, I say they actually have to come into KHS and listen to them. I won't give them an audio file. And the reason for that is it's not a legal issue for me. This tracking down somebody that used an oral history interview without permission is essentially not enforceable. Let's be honest. However, I want to honor the intentions of the person who shared their life with me. And without that agreement, I can't be for sure what their intent was. And so for me, it's more about let's not poison the well for other oral historians that go out there and want to do interviews. Let's make sure that we're being really responsible with that person's intent. Most repositories that do accept oral histories will have their own that you can use. And if you, and at this point, when thinking about a legal release agreement, you should have already chosen that repository. You can make your own. There are good examples from oral history programs online. Any basic oral history guide that you buy is going to have some boilerplate language that you can use. And essentially, being full disclosure, ours, the Nunn Center at UK and ours is almost identical. And so within Kentucky, I do know that those two forms have been vetted by at least our cabinet legal for what that's worth. It's worth a lot to me as an employee. And so you can feel confident that you copy our language and you change the basics, that you'll be safe using this document. I always send this to people in advance if I can, especially if they're email users. That way they can look at it, and if they have questions, you want everybody to feel like they're informed when they sign this. Hey, if they want to show it to their lawyer, that's their dime, and that's fine with me. But I like to send it in advance to if just to make sure that we don't have an awkward situation when the interview's over. And obviously, when you speak with them, you want to make sure they understand that they are going to have to sign a release if they want it to be used for your project. And I bring 2 copies to the interview. And that way you sign them in tandem, and there's no accidental, I forgot to make a copy and send it to this person. You're showing trust, you're showing good faith, and you're both leaving with a valid copy. And then once you're done with the interview, the other accompanying paperwork, data sheet or information form, again, any basic oral history guide that you pick up is going to have sort of a template for this for you. But you're going to want to do that at its root. It's the person's name, contact information, a synopsis of the topics of the interview, any sort of proper nouns that might not be common that you need to spell out or make sure or explain, like neighborhoods and other people's names that come up. And then, if you're feeling particularly fastidious and you love your archivist, you will include Library of Congress subject headings. And that way you can ensure that whoever is doing your cataloging, whether they're a friend, acquaintance, or you don't even know them at all, is going to have all the resources they need to make sure that your interview is as searchable and findable as it possibly can be. So those data sheets are very important if you're interested in the accessibility of your interview later on. And then indexes are always nice. An index in this case is going to be going through the interview, writing a time mark down, and indicating when subjects change. Generally, it's going to be when you ask a new question, but going through and letting them know that you're going to be talking about Battle of the Bulge at minute 10, and then you moved on, by minute 45, you were already talking about coming back home and what that was like. That's really helpful to a researcher to be able to find what they're looking for in the absence of a transcript. So any questions about paperwork? There usually are a lot of questions about release agreements because these are a legal documents. I will say what often comes up is people requesting restrictions after the fact. So for example, they've listened to their interview and they realize they said something unkind about their sister-in-law or whatever, or a public figure is actually more, it's a public figure who has said something possibly libelous or slanderous about, I can never remember the difference between the two, about another elected official, and they want that section removed. Or they want to restrict the interview, or they don't want you to use it anymore. So if they say, we don't want you to use the interview at all, tell them you can restrict it, and offer the restriction of time. So for example, if it was true and it was just unkind, can we use it later? If it was unkind and not true, the very last thing you want to do is edit the interview. But if that's the only thing that can be done, you can. And then obviously at that point you need to update the legal release agreement and put evidence, especially if it's email, of your correspondence with that release agreement. So before anybody asks that, yes, that does happen, and yes, it does come up. Normally it's something being a big deal is relative to that person. But don't let anybody carry on. If somebody starts talking about, God, I wish I could say this doesn't happen, but it does. If somebody starts talking about what might be an active crime or a potential crime or a crime that's still under the statute of limitations while you're talking to them, stop them immediately and don't record it. And warn them that anything that they say could possibly be subpoenaed. So that's another question I get a lot. What if somebody admitted to a crime during the interview? Well, don't let them do that. Back it up. Obviously, if there's potential crimes, then you're under another ethical dilemma, and I'll let you sort that out with your pastor, and we'll move on. So I think we've kind of gotten into this a little bit, but I want to talk about the nature of memory. when talking about project topics and scope. So maybe you're interested in doing oral history interviews because you think it's a valuable resource you want for your institution, but you're not really sure what would be a good topic. You know, we've mentioned a World War II Veterans History Project, and I've been using that as an example, but let's talk a little bit about what's possible. So the majority of projects that we have focus on capturing memories before they're gone. And again, that's important. And let's explore memory. So I want you to chat a historically important event that happened to you when you were a child. And this is one thing that will date you without having to put your birth date down, but I'll type mine. So I typed mine in. It was the Columbine shooting when I was in high school. So we have the moon landing. That always comes up, especially this year with the anniversary of the moon landing. Mine was the shooting in Columbine High School. Someone saw JFK at a rally. 9/11, Watergate, the Challenger, Heath High School. Yeah, we actually have somebody doing an oral history project on Heath High School right now. Kennedy assassination. Oh, I noticed. Okay, Leanne Paxton said the person doing the Heath High School oral history project is her sister-in-law. I noticed you have to be from Paducah if your last name's Paxton. Well, I will say Nathan Lynn, who's in Paducah, is on the Oral History Commission. He's the chair of the Oral History Commission right now, and he's one of my favorite people in Paducah. He's sorry, it wouldn't be Kentucky if we didn't play this game, right?
That's right.
You know,
3 degrees.
Chris says everybody already mentioned mine. Oh, okay. So now you can just kind of think about this. Feel free to type it if you want to, but it's more of just an internal exercise. How did you feel about it then? I want you to go back to that day, maybe when you heard about it on the news, or your mom woke you up and told you about it, or whatever the case may be. And I want you to really like dig into that memory, and I want you to describe how you felt about it then. I also want to explore a child's interpretation. So how did you interpret it then as a child? I'll kind of model this. So when I heard about Columbine, I was 17, so I would have been the same age as the perpetrators and the victims. And of course, there was still a naive feeling that it couldn't happen. You know, this happened in Colorado. So far away, it can never happen here. Obviously, I felt terrible for the victims. I also there was kind of we'll call it a zeitgeist, or a narrative at the time that was saying that the perpetrators were victims too, that they were bullies, and that if we would treat people better, these types of things wouldn't happen, that they were going after people that they felt had bullied them, and things like that. So that was sort of the narrative at the time. And I remember there was big movements after that to really be nicer to people, but it was in a very superficial way. It was like, don't make the weird guy mad, which is not helpful. You know what I mean? That's even worse. So that's kind of how I felt about it at the time as a teenager. Yeah, and Laura, who was closer to a school shooting, it was just the opposite. She felt like somebody was. It was very close. It was just a county over, so it seemed like everybody knew somebody who was directly affected. Confusion, feeling very confused, like the world is going to end. Okay. Feel free to keep typing on these, but I want to make sure that we don't go over time. Now, I want you to think about how you feel it now. You don't have to necessarily to describe it, but I'm gonna model it. So obviously, Columbine was not the last school shooting. It could happen everywhere and anywhere, and it did. And the narrative about people that perpetrate these crimes is very different. It's not they're bullied. There's a lot of issues around mental health and gun control, and everybody's really fighting and trying to figure out how to stop this. There's my poor child who's 8 years old has to go through active shooter training in his little classroom with all his little friends. That if you described that to me when I was 17, I would have been I when I was 17, I thought this is the worst thing that could possibly happen. Nothing worse. And then little did I know that it would become, at least last year anyway, it seemed like a daily occurrence, right? So I think very differently about it now. I don't really, judge me for this if you want, but I don't really have a lot of empathy like I did for the perpetrators of Columbine. And that's no longer the narrative anyway. And as a mother, as opposed to a child, I definitely don't have a lot of empathy, right? And other things like Sandy Hook that came later obviously have changed my feelings about that. So examine those things that have changed your perception. For me, it was other events that happened after, time, age, but also becoming a mother. There are things that happen in your life that completely change your worldview. So, how has your perspective changed? And what caused those changes? What influenced it? So you don't have to type these necessarily, but really think about, you know, who you were when 9/11 happened, your feelings about it then, your feelings about it now, those factors in your life that may have changed your perspective. So that's why I say it's important to interview people of all ages at different stages of their life. Um, and we should be making sure that we have diverse interviewers and interviewees, because I'm not the person to do an oral history project about the Heath High School shooting. And maybe somebody that was at that school isn't. But someone in that community who was affected by it, maybe at a different school, would be a good person. Should gender matter in that process? Maybe not, but maybe it does. So, when thinking about the types of projects that you do at your local library, um, I'm not slamming veterans projects. I think they're important, but think broadly about the historical events that have happened in your community. Who's affected by them, and at what age? Whoops. No, we're good. Okay. So here is the part that people have the most anxiety about it. And this came up, of course, in the poll in terms of things that people wanted to know the most about. Obviously, the interview process was big, but this is part of that, right? In some ways. Again, we're an equipment dependent discipline. So, what you want to think about first and foremost is your comfort level. How comfortable are you using audio equipment to begin with? I will tell you, in this day and age, is very similar to using a cellular phone, particularly a smartphone. Then what can you afford or borrow? So if you're embarking on a a project that's going to be multi-year and ongoing, obviously you're going to want to invest in your own equipment. But if it's 10 interviews, what can you borrow? Whatever you purchase, and I can't endorse any specific product, like both legally and plus I don't want to, because I don't want you to buy something and have it break and blame it on me. Make sure that it's recording an uncompressed file at 96 kilohertz and 24-bit. That's a sample, right? And that's basically the quality of the interview that you're getting. I will tell you right now, Walmart does not have what you need. You're going to have to buy it online. It will be very difficult unless you're very close to an audio centric place like the Doo Wop Shop in Louisville or Lexington. I think we have one in Frankfurt too. To find something of this caliber. That doesn't mean it's expensive. It's just not one of those things that everybody's clamoring for, right? So they're not going to keep it in stock at a brick and mortar store. And the reason this is so important is because a beautiful interview recorded on terrible equipment it can't be saved. There's only so much I can do to fix a bad interview. So I had a woman call me when I first started this job. She was very nice, and she said, I used to do oral history interviews, when my kids were young and I was a stay-at-home parent, and I want to get back into that again, sort of now that they're out of the house. But I know we don't use cassettes anymore, so what should I buy? And I gave her some options. I went down the list and gave her things at different price points. And she said, "Well, I'm gonna have to ask my husband, and I'll get back to you." So she called me and said, maybe a few days later, and said, "Well, I asked my husband, and he said that was too much money. So what should I get instead?" And I almost said, I was this close to saying, "You need a new husband," but instead, I helped her out and tried to find her something at a different price point. And the reason I feel strongly about that, like I said, is I have cassette tapes that were recorded on bad equipment, and I can only, if the volume's low, I can only crank that volume so high without getting all the room noise in it too. If it's spotty, once the magnetic tape drops, that information is gone. And plus I don't have a lot of time to do that type of thing. And to send it off is a very expensive process. So recording it in the moment as best it could possibly be done is important. You want something that will accept external microphones, preferably an XLR input, which is like the one that's about the size of a nickel and has prongs on the inside of it. It's basically kind of a standard microphone um, cord, and you're going to want a condenser microphone, not a dynamic microphone. So you don't really want the kind that like people use on stage. You're going to have a specific kind. You want it to have a cardioid pattern, which means it records, if the microphone's facing you, it records in a pattern kind of like a heart shape. That's why it's called cardioid. The other options are omnidirectional and bidirectional, and you don't want those. You want cardioid. You can buy microphones that you can change the pattern, and that's a nice purchase because that means you can tell your boss, "Oh, we can do conference calls with this," or, um, I can use them for interviews. So you're gonna want good brands include, and I have some of all of these: Audio Technica, Rode, Sennheiser, Blue, Shure, are all good microphones. Um, and then in terms of what you're going to actually be recording on, what we use nowadays, and Justin said that he uses Zooms and Tascams. I like Zooms and Tascams. Um, I like the Zoom better, and I'll explain why in a minute. Um, you can spend anything from about $300 on up to $650 and much, much more. That Zoom H4n, that's Pro, is my go-to. And these things record onto media that's an SD card or something similar, just like a digital camera would. And so you need to think about buying media for them too. I wouldn't get anything smaller than 16 gigabytes. That'll make sure that you always have enough memory to record, 4 days worth of interviews almost. But I like to do overkill on that. If it's only a few dollars more, why not? I think the Zoom is better than the Tascam because the Zoom takes an SD card, an actual SD card. Whereas the Tascam now, they didn't used to, but now takes a micro. SD cards are a more stable media format. They're less likely to become corrupted, whereas those little micro media, smaller than an SD, are sometimes very easy to be corrupted. So until somebody tells me otherwise, I go with the Zoom. I think they're pretty easy to use. They also have good internal microphones. So if you can't invest in the external microphones, which can run very expensive, you're still pretty good with the internal microphones on any of this equipment. The other thing you can do is use your existing laptop and a USB microphone. And I only know one on the market right now, again, until somebody tells me different, that can record at that uncompressed rate. And this is called a Yeti Pro, and it's made by the Blue Microphone Company. The cool thing about that is it can be used as a USB microphone, or you can plug it into your recording device and it can be used with an XLR cord too. And it records at that high quality rate. It's only about $270 and it comes with the software. So if you already have a laptop that can run that software, this is going to be your best price investment, I think. I just bought a couple. The only thing you want to make sure is when you're doing an interview, sometimes it's easy when you're using a laptop to hide behind the screen. And that doesn't really build the kind of like interview situation that you want. So, but those are just some options. And I order all of our equipment through a company called Sweetwater. Again, I'm not endorsing them, but I know they have what you need, and they usually will set you up with like your own like client advisor. And so you can say, I'm a library, I got $400. This is what I want to do. And they understand oral history. Stuart is my guy, Stuart Heisey. He knows what oral historians need. So that is a good resource. Someone mentioned recording audio at the local radio station. Absolutely. If you can build them, as a matter of fact, invite them to your initial meeting and then see if they will offer up the space or beg them for it, one or the way, because you can't, they're going to have much more, obviously they're going to have an audio engineer that can help you, and they're going to have better equipment than you would ever be able to afford. So let's get into setting up the interview, and you can continue to, B&H Photo, Justin just mentioned B&H, they're pretty great too, and they have more than just photo equipment, and sometimes they have refurbished items, so you might get a little bit of a deal. So after you've chosen your interviewee, the next thing to think about is to call them or to meet them in person. It depends on what their limitations are. And then you're just going to want to talk and chat with them and talk about the project that you're doing, the questions, not the questions themselves, but the topics you'll be going over, build a relationship. And then you want to talk about any off limits topics or questions. You are going to want to do that before the interview because it's awkward and uncomfortable if you stumble upon one of those during the interview. And then at that time, you'll want to schedule when you can come and do the actual formal interview. Next is to choose a location. So this is always hard because you're going to be balancing your need for good sound quality versus the interviewee's comfort and the barriers. So if someone's in a nursing facility, obviously it might not be an option for them to go off site, so you're just going to have to deal with it. There are also safety dynamics. So like you don't know this person, right? And you're going to this interview alone. Do you want to go to their house? Do you feel comfortable? I have interns a lot who are generally youngish college students and female women. And I make them text me before they go. I make them text me when they leave. If I don't hear from them in 120 minutes, I'm calling them. And I try to make them take a buddy. I don't want to patronize them, but I try to make them take somebody with them if possible. And you can always use the excuse of, it's nice to have somebody watching the equipment while you focus on the interview. So I try to think of those things too. But selfishly, first and foremost, I always think of sound quality. So the picture on the left that you're looking at is from the Kentucky Historical Society's archives. Does anybody know what those things are sitting on the sidewalk, those white boxes? Christy knows. Ice boxes. They are ice boxes. So they're early refrigerators. They are not, I don't know if they're electric or not. I hope they're not, because I wish refrigerators still weren't electric, and here's why. Everybody wants to do interviews in their kitchen because there's a table and there's chairs. It makes perfect sense, right? Your refrigerator is the loudest thing in your house. You don't realize it because you hear it every day. When I sit down to do an interview, it feels like a Rottweiler is breathing in my ear. And so I actually have colleagues that will take their keys, car keys, and put them in the freezer and unplug the refrigerator and tell their interviewee, I have unplugged your refrigerator, but I put my car keys in there. So I won't forget to plug it back in. I have to get my keys. I don't have the nerve to do something like that, so I do try to find an alternative interview space. The other thing is your HVAC system is loud, so loud. So that's the benefit of doing it someplace like a radio station. They've already thought about those considerations when they built the space. However, those aren't comfortable spaces. And if you're really talking about an intimate topic, sometimes there's a value to being in that person's home. Being in a comfortable space has the obvious asset of comfort, but also familiarity. Looking around can spark memories. They may see a picture on the wall or something like that that helps them kind of jog their memory. So you're going to want to balance that. I don't have a good answer, but it's all just going to depend on the person in the interview and your comfort level too. I like neutral spaces because I can control the environment, but obviously I will go to somebody's house if that's the only option, or to their living facility. Oh, and when you're talking to your interviewer, be honest about how much time. Don't say, oh, we're just going to be there for a few minutes and chit chat. I'm going to need your undivided attention for at least 60 minutes, and build in time for coffee afterwards. Do not schedule a meeting after an interview, because first of all, you're going to be exhausted. Second of all, you've just had this experience. You don't want to rush out. It's rude. Unless they want to rush you out, that's different. If you're interviewing family members, do not pick a holiday. They are too noisy. There's too much going on. I do not give questions in advance, and the reason why is because you're going to get rote answers if you do that. And always practice with your equipment the night before, even if you're really familiar. I always do this weird thing in my kitchen where I walk around and use the microphone and clap and make noises, just to do a little refresher. So let's talk about researching questions. These are obviously going to be unique to each project and based on other historical and biographical resources. And later, they're going to be informed by interviews you've already done. So people will bring up things that you want to ask future interviewers. You're going to develop a set of questions, but they don't need to be too detailed. Think about broad general topics with I usually bring a notebook or a notepad with me. I write a question at the top and leave the rest of the page blank and then go into the next page. That leaves me plenty of room to talk about follow-up questions and jot down notes and things like that. For an hour interview, I usually go with no more than 10 questions. And then, of course, that doesn't mean those are the only questions you're going to ask. It just means that you're prepared to write down follow-ups as the topics evolve. Make sure they're open-ended and not leading. You can have a research question or a hypothesis about what you're doing, but you're not going to want to fit that dialogue to it. So don't have some kind of preconceived idea about what information you're going to receive. Didn't you just have a delightful time in the Army? Well, not everybody did, just kind of being open to that person's unique experience is important. So that's kind of how you formulate those questions. Again, doing it as a team is always helpful. And if you have someone on your team that did an interview that you weren't privy to, kind of asking them later on what came up and what might inform your questions for your next one is very important. And then that's the beauty of having a diverse team. They may glean something in the interview that you didn't, because of sharing similar life experience, right? So during the interview, this is the fun part. And we may end up at time on this, but that's fine. You have the whole PowerPoint. You guys were so awesome and interactive, more so than I thought you were going to be, that I'm rushing. But that's my fault, not yours. You're awesome. So during the interview, I always ask a question that you can't possibly get wrong in the beginning. usually it's off topic. I don't want to jump into that right away. So I ask a softball question. And I don't know how this is going to work. Charlie can kind of, because I have some audio clips I want to share with you of examples.
Yeah, the audio files are embedded. So what we're going to do is there's a little speaker icon to the left of the bullet point where it says ask a softball question. And we're just going to, we're going to hush here in just a second and ask you all to. Teresa, you should see a speaker icon next to the sentence that says ask a softball question first.
Okay, so that was my intern, Emma, and she was interviewing the county judge executive of Boyle County. And before she launched into the interview, while she was setting the level, she asked him something he couldn't get wrong. And that's the purpose of asking that question. You want to make sure to set them up as sort of the um, expert and to make them feel like the rest of the questions are going to be just as easy, right? Okay. And so the next thing, I'm going to skip over this one. It's pretty self-explanatory. You're going to give an introduction. In which you're going to do in that introduction, you want to give the date, the place that you're at, whether it's just the county, the city, or you get specific as an address, the two people that are present, you and the interviewee. You could even spell out the names if you want to, and then you're gonna talk about. You're gonna say what you're talking about. Maybe list the project name and the purpose. And I even asked them. So, for example, Mr. McKinney, are you? We're going to be doing this interview about your time as a county judge executive. Are you okay with being recorded today? And what that does, if your paperwork gets separated, God forbid, from the interview, you still have that consent within, again, I don't know if it stands up in a court of law, but it makes me feel much more comfortable than not having it. So I will skip this one too. I'll trust me, you'll get to hear the best one. You want to start a trend of long answers. So if you start out by asking somebody, okay, where were you born? That's a one-word answer. Mm-hmm. Obviously, you want to get contextual information, but what that does, people have a hard time getting out of a trend of short answers. They start giving short answers for things that you would rather them go into more detail about. So sometimes I'll wait to do the biographical information at the end, especially if it's not totally relevant to the project. Obviously, if it's about early childhood in Nelson County, you'll want to go into it. So what I would do is I'll say, Mr. Smith, I want you to tell me your enrollment story. How did you how did you join the military? Something like that. So that, I mean, that's not a one, I hope that's not just a one-word answer. Mm-hmm. That's going to be more complex. Ask one question at a time. I am so guilty of trying to get, I have a lot of thoughts at once, and I want to know all the answers at once. And so I'll say, tell me your enrollment question. Why did you join the Army? What type of job did you do in the military? And it's like, save it. There's plenty of time. You have 120 minutes. And this may go without saying, but avoid closed-ended questions. You don't want to ask unless it's just a follow-up to get confirmation of a detail, like, oh, which rank is, was that? Were you, sergeant or captain? That's fine, but you don't want to ask a lot of closed-ended questions like that. Next, I'm going to play you the example I have of a leading question because it's egregious, and I think you'll get the point. So you will click the speaker icon that's right next to the bullet point that says try not to ask leading questions. So that gentleman obviously was not really asking a question. He was trying to get somebody to confirm what he already believed, right? So that's not what you're doing. You want to make sure that you're not imposing your own bias as much as possible in the way that you phrase the question. I know somebody who does interviewees with Ku Klux Klan members. I don't know how in the world she does it, but she does. And then, of course, the next thing is to be ready with follow up questions. Every once in a while, somebody will just kind of throw you a curveball. It's fine to go on tangents as long as they are relevant to the topic. And then, if it's a tangent that doesn't necessarily have relevance, don't interrupt. Handle it gracefully. You can spend 5 or so seconds talking about the grandchildren before you launch into the details. So gracefully be like, thank you for sharing that story with me. They sound like they're just darling. I want to go back to what you said about the submarine in Lake Erie, which is actually one of the examples you can listen to. As for specific examples, I try to get people to give me sensory details. Well, what did that feel like, or how did that sound? And then some people will say, well, it was really hard working on a farm when I was 16. I'll be like, well, what types of things did you have to do? How was it difficult? So making sure you follow up and get more details. And then look for signs of exhaustion. When you start getting those one-word answers again, it's time to cut it off, and you can always come back another day. But yeah, the how so is always a great question. Tell me what you mean by that. And you just get better at this as you go along. And even after, I don't know, 20 something years, I still have a stinker of an interview. It has to do, I'm having a bad day. Maybe they weren't ready for it. Maybe they're just not a verbose person. Um, but they always feel good afterwards. And if hopefully you've made a friend one way or the other. So after the interview, you're going to want to move those audio files to some type of hard drive or server immediately. Like I said, that media is easily corruptible, and you don't want to leave it sitting in the device. And again, it's nice to have an pre-archivist, I guess I would say, on your team who can name those files for you and keep them safe. Then you're going to want to send a copy to the interviewee. I always buy a bunch of little thumb drives. Like, they get cheaper and cheaper, and you can get them branded now, and send those to the interviewee. They have a right to review the interview before you do anything public with it, and to make those hopefully not, but make those restrictions if necessary. I believe in handwritten thank you notes. In this it's already complicated enough by technology with the recorder. Doing a handwritten thank you note for doing an interview, I think, is important. And then you're going to want to complete all of your paperwork. Don't wait, because the farther away the interview gets, the less you'll remember it, and you will have to re-listen to the interview, which is not a bad thing, but it does add time to an already time-consuming process. So if you're looking for, I talked about this in a different webinar, but I'll just briefly, the Kentucky Oral History Commission does offer some assistance for doing these projects. The first one is kind of an equipment loan and training. And basically, the application for it is a project plan for all intents and purposes. And then you can borrow some of our equipment, which we are out of right now for the first time since I've been here because we have such a demand. And then I will come and do this training, but obviously we will go more in depth. It will be more interactive, and it will be tailored to the topic that you're talking about. And then we offer a project grant. So if you're ready to have to get paid to do this, we have we have deadlines, and one just passed in September, and we have another one coming up in March. And this covers mainly interview hour time, so the time you're actually doing interviewing, and then travel and supplies. We do let you purchase equipment, but you have to give it back to us at the end. So basically what I recommend people do is put rental of equipment in there. And it's a one-to-one match, but it can be 100% in kind, which is rare. And it's available to individuals, which is even more rare. And I'm not going to share you this clip, but I hope you will listen to it in the PDF, because it's making the point that you should record like anybody can be listening in the future. Obviously, you're doing your recordings for a specific... This is me on the left, by the way, if you've been wondering what I look like the whole time. I've lost 20 pounds, by the way, so do take that into consideration. So this... This is a story. My friend Maria on the right, she works at the Kentucky Library and Museum at Western, and she is a friend and was interested in what I did for a living, but only went online to search my archive like maybe a year after I met her. Someone had done an interview with her grandmother for a project. She had no idea her grandmother had been interviewed. And she called me and she said, could I have a copy of this interview? And I'm like, yeah, I can send it to you today. Um, I did. Turned out her grandmother had just recently died, and I was able to give her back her grandmother's voice. So obviously you're recording for your project, but you want to do the best possible recording quality you can, because you never know who these things are going to be important to in the future, whether it's a researcher or a family member. So listen to that interview. It's her grandmother. It's a short clip of it. And the funny thing about it, Maria and her grandmother have the same exact regional accent, and you hear a lot of, it's obvious that there's a family relation. And it's her grandmother was a sharecropper. She doesn't ever say that outright, but it's obvious from like the context that she's talking about. And she tells a really interesting story about a tornado. So very quickly, I'm going to go through opportunities. So maybe you don't know what you want to do, but there are other larger collecting initiatives you can get involved in. The Library of Congress has been doing a Veterans History Project for a long time. Your library can participate and contribute. Again, this is kind of like a secondary repository agreement. They go to the Veterans History Project, but you can still use them locally. They offer materials. They already have a release form. They already have background information forms, those type of things for you. So this is a good way to get involved in a project and to kind of use that name and their branding and that recognition to get that ball rolling in your community. Right now, the Kentucky Oral History Commission has a collecting project, and you all are the first to learn that in a couple of weeks we'll be posting paid opportunities for individuals to collect interviews about women who have been active in politics or had careers or roles in government. We're kind of doing this in celebration of the ratification of the 19th Amendment. We realize we're not going to get oral history interviews from women who cast their first vote when that was passed. However, we want to look at the impact of women in those intervening years. How have women been active in government politics? And we have a field guide. I'll send Charlie the link because I realized I didn't embed that in the slide. But this is a good guidebook too. It has our release form in it. It has all of sort of the tips and things that I talked about today for the interviewing process. And if you just kind of want to get your feet wet with doing interviews and it helps to have, a pre-existing project to get involved with, you can do an interview. It can be a friend or a family member. And when we say government politics, I mean advocate, activist, dog catcher, any kind of public office or government role, or a political role too. So that's available to you. And like I said, we will have paid opportunities for that. And then share anything that you've done. I hate for things to just sit on a shelf and collect dust. This is something that I share with genealogy folks that are into genealogy. I just realized my circle around it is off center, but that's okay. This is an interview with my grandmother who was a wave during World War II. I contributed to the Veterans History Project, but I also posted it to SoundCloud and made it public. And then I put a link in it to her Ancestry.com profile, and that way any of our family members who might be looking for her, connecting with, I got her permission, obviously. You will not do this without, especially if it's your grandma. Don't do it without permission. But this is a way that genealogists can be actively involved in collecting genealogy or genealogical pertinent information about current family members that might be helpful to distant relatives or folks in the future. So it's a really simple process, and the DAR is really into doing this kind of thing. Daughters of the American Revolution. So, and last but not least, public libraries are already sharing. Boone County, I think it's Boone County. Boone County Public Library did a really extensive oral history project in those early days, and they have posted those interviews, and you might recognize these icons from Kentucky Libraries Unbound. say that? Yeah, Kentucky Libraries Unbound. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how it works. Call them if you're interested. If you have oral history interviews in your library already, if they are some that belong to us, technically you can still do this with them because, again, you're a secondary repository. You have all the same rights we do, and we love it when people share these things out. It's nice to see the work that we paid for early on getting used now. So you already have a great resource, a toolkit at your disposal, a way to share oral histories with the public. Just make sure there's release forms. That would be my only. Again, it's not something that you can really enforce, but it is nice to make sure that you honor people's intent. So that's all I have. This is my contact information. I'm sorry I'm over time. But if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them. That's why I'm there 8:30 to 5 every single day. I'd love to come to your library and do this presentation for the public. And of course, tailor it to your area and your topics that might be relevant to your constituencies there. I always bring equipment with me and let people play with them. That sort of makes it less intimidating. It's sort of like exposure therapy for like people that are scared of snakes. If they get to play with it a little bit, they seem a little bit less intimidated. And then I want to make sure if you're looking for resources, be specific about what you might need, whether it's a good guidebook or more information about equipment. I'm always happy to answer emails about that. It's much more interesting than the other bureaucratic things that I get to do. So definitely use my time and my expertise.
Okay. Thank you, Sarah, so much. And before everybody, I know we're a little bit over time, so before y'all run out, I want to go ahead and open the survey. I usually wait till the very, very end to do this. I'm going to pop it open on your screen, and if you don't want to do it right this second, you can just minimize it and come back to it, but I want to make sure I got that open while y'all were still in here. Thank you to the Institute of Museum and Library Services for their sponsorship of this webinar. We are on social media. And the downloads are available in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen. The one that says Oral History PDF is the full-size version of the slides that you can save to your computer, and that should have all those sound files available to go back and listen to later. And feel free to share this with your coworkers, colleagues, anybody in the community that's interested in it. The webinar was recorded, and I'll be posting it to our archived webinars page within about a week. And if you're watching this live, you'll be getting a certificate of attendance as well, hopefully in the next day or so. So any final questions for Sarah? Doesn't look like it. All right, thank you all so much for attending. Whenever you're ready to exit, just click the X in the top right-hand corner of the screen, and we give Sarah a round of applause. Thank you for being here. Y'all have a great afternoon.